Good morning and welcome. Malaysian Studies has a long pedigree here at ICES and is an important part of what this institute concentrates on. Today we will have presentations from 4 of our colleagues on the 13th general elections in Malaysia. They bring many years of study and analysis to the table, and this has been complemented by extensive time on the ground in the run-up to the elections. Just before the campaign period began, my colleagues sat down and plotted a strategy to cover different aspects and territories before and during the elections. We will enjoy the result of this today, as they will present us with data and observations from various parts of the country, spanning East and West Malaysia, as well as both urban and rural contexts. Dr. Ooi Kee Bing, the Deputy Director of ICES, will be our first speaker. He is the author of many books on Malaysia, perhaps the most well-known of which is The Reluctant Politician, Tun Dr. Ismail and His Time. Fittingly, Dr. Ooi spent much of his time in Malaysia, in Johor, Dr. Ismail's birthplace. Dr. Meredith Wise will be our second speaker. She is a visiting researcher here at ICES and an associate professor of political science at the State University of New York, Albany. She has written extensively on student activism and civil society in Malaysia. She has been overseeing a 4-country project on electoral dynamics in the region, the first part of which focused on Malaysia. Beyond the survey itself, Meredith managed to cover all 13 states in a 2-week period from a rather cramped vehicle, or so I heard. Professor James Chin is also a visiting researcher here at ICES and a professor of political science and head of the School of Arts and Sciences at the Sunway campus of Monash University. He looks at minority rights, elections, democratization, and good governance issues. Professor Chin is one of the foremost authorities on electoral dynamics in East Malaysia, and today he will be sharing his insights, particularly on the elections in Sarawak. Dr. Lee Hock Wan is Senior Fellow and coordinator of the Malaysian Studies Group here at ICES. His research centers on democratization and civil society, as well as nation-state formation. The focus of his presentation will be on structural inequalities in the electoral system, looking particularly at things such as gerrymandering. Each of the speakers will speak for 20 minutes, after which we will proceed to have questions from the floor. On a personal level, I've been waiting for this, so I will stop talking now and hand over to Dr. Ooi.
Hello. Hi. Thanks, Francis. First, I would like to start by thanking Dr. Meredith Wise for joining the rest of us here today. Thank you, Meredith. Meredith is actually only just visiting for a few months for the elections, and she's in charge of a whole group of people doing quantitative research in Malaysia. Welcome. Right, I'll start off. Now, I've spent most of the campaign period in Johor, but I don't think I'll just keep to talking about Johor, because what we witnessed 2 weeks ago was actually something much bigger than just Johor. But of course, later I'll be able to take any questions about Johor that you might ask. I think I will, in an attempt to avoid too much overlap with what my colleagues will be talking about, I think I'll give some big picture comments, if you like, about what was happening in Johor. It's hard to just look at, the sights and smells and whatever without actually putting them in a context of something much, much bigger. And that thing that is much, much bigger, of course, is, well, there are a few ways of looking at it. But in Malaysia, I think we have to think of the elections as actually the end of a very, very long campaign period in Malaysia that started on the 3rd of April 2009 when Najib became Prime Minister, through what some would call an internal coup in UMNO. And he was put there for the purpose of winning back votes. So he had 4 years in which to come to a point where he could make a serious dent in the expansion of the opposition. And so a lot of the politics over the last 4 years have actually to be seen in that context. It was not so much nation building as campaigning, I think. That's one way of looking at it. Other periodizations, I think, that became obvious during the campaign period was, of course, the continuing growth of the opposition, of an opposition coalition. It was something that started rather tentatively, 2008, but by this year we see that it's actually growing into a veritable coalition that can actually challenge the BN on its own turf, Johor especially. So that's another perspective, another context to place everything in. Another is once you look at the groundswell, for want of a better word, that has been happening in Malaysia since at least the Reformasi, 1998, when Anwar Ibrahim was kicked out from being Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, but he refused to go. And that refusal, I think, is important. That refusal precipitated something that we are still experiencing today with the almost daily rallies that are going on. I think all that has to be seen in one big sweep. One other thing to look at that we should remember here, of course, and because of the results, it didn't seem to be very important, which was that after 2008, around 2009, UMNO youth became rather tame, rather civilized, under Khairi, I think. And I think that sort of changed the dynamics of UMNO politics within itself. But of course, that left room for Perkasa and such groups to come into being. These would be we call them the right-wingers, the racial extremists. And I think during Najib's period of transformation, as he calls it, from 2009 until today, I think a lot of damage, in a way, was done by the fact that you had a very strong Perkasa group pushing. While UMNO youth very happily, I think, just pulled back and let Perkasa do the dirty work. But then we saw in the elections that Perkasa actually did badly. The two leaders actually did not win, which we should all be happy for, I think, because if they had won, then Parliament over the next 5 years is going to be hell, I think. But they did not get in, so let's see if somebody else picks up their banner within Parliament, the Home Affairs Minister, perhaps. Yeah. Well, that's part of the backdrop that I see, within which we have to look at the elections. Now, the groundswell is not just one thing that gets forgotten when we look at the two coalitions fighting each other is that they are actually expressive of something else in society. Malaysia has changed since 1998, at least. And another periodization that's very important here, I think, is to think of Mahathir's retirement, right? In October, was it? October 2004, wasn't it? 2003. And after that we had Abdullah and then we had Najib. So it's sort of reforming Mahathirism 1.0 and reforming Mahathirism 2.0, right? All done while Mahathir sits in the background. So Malaysian politics looks in a way like that, and I think UMNO politics, BN politics, has to be studied as a continuing battle going on within UMNO. Okay, enough about the backdrop. We can talk more about that later. Now, the election campaign itself, I'll give some views, generalizations, of course, on what I experienced while in Johor. I decided to just rent a car and drive around Johor just to see what things look like. And the first striking thing one felt was that it was very hard to find BN rallies. You had BN dinners. All the rallying seemed to be done by the opposition. And I would say that the first few days, perhaps the first week of the 15-day campaigning, one could see that at some of these rallies, they were not overswelling in numbers, quite a lot. Probably because TV is so bad, I don't know. People in Johor watch CNA, by the way, actually. So people were there because they were curious. They had never seen Tony Phua before. They had never seen Kit Siang before, perhaps. But then you saw that during the second week, things had really changed. So as I always say, you can't predict Malaysian politics because the campaigning is so decisive. So if you predict before the campaign, you're ignoring a factor that is really, really important. to election results. And very clearly this time around as well, the second week, things were going really, going quite, I wouldn't say wild, but the sentiments were up. BN rallies almost didn't exist. First, they didn't even advertise. You could go to BN Johor Facebook and you would find almost nothing, if you could find the page at all. But if you go to PKR Johor Facebook, DAP Johor Facebook, and they updated all the time, and they would tell you where the rallies are and hopefully where the speakers will be, because the speakers were moving around to 5 rallies a night, especially the second week. So it was that kind of atmosphere. And after a while, one did notice that, I'm sure my colleagues will say more about that, that it wasn't so much a party versus party kind of coalition. It was competition. It was a coalition versus coalition competition now. So cross-voting, I think, became quite rampant. That was something that was seen as a curiosity once upon a time, but I think this is part of the two coalition system now. People actually see two coalitions, and so they will vote for PKR. Doesn't matter if it's PAS or DAP in the territory. I mean, I'm speaking very generally. And that could be seen also in how the rallies were becoming organized. Now, as you know, in Johor especially, after Kit Siang came down, Mahathir immediately started playing the racial card about how with Kit Siang coming back to his home state of Johor, somehow or the cooperation between Malays and Chinese was going to end. There was, of course, behind that is the threat of May 13, and others joined in as well. I think Sharizad said as much. And so that, I think, caused quite a stir in the opposition camp, because that was the kind of campaigning they were trying very, very hard to avoid. Because their discourse was about governance and nothing racial, nothing religious. So they were trying to avoid that as much as possible. And I suppose in response to that, that was why Mahathir was immediately taking up race and religion, things like that. But what was interesting in the rallies themselves was that the opposition's response to this spreading of fear was to turn their rallies into celebrations, festival, You could see that more and more, especially the last 5-7 days. And they had the means because, again, because of the groundswell that's been happening in Malaysia, civil society had become the third player here. We're not talking about two coalitions. We're talking about civil society and society at large, urban society especially. And over the last 4 years, those who have been following would have seen that many colors came into being, right? Yellow, of course, for Bersih, and then red has come into being, green because of the environmental movement. And all this because they were part of this groundswell and could easily be adopted by the opposition. So the opposition could use all these rainbow colors, which they used to good effect, at least in Johor Bahru, I think. They were, instead of giving out money to people to attend their rallies, they were actually collecting money, and they had shops set up to sell T-shirts of all colors. They were selling their hornbill mascot, always sold out, by the way. You really couldn't get them. So they were, and because of that, you had shops. They had shops. So it added to the festival feeling. And I talked to some of the opposition leaders, and of course, that was one way of getting money, but it was also meant, it had that added effect of making things festival-like. And I think some of you might have felt that if you were there in Johor. At the end, it would, especially when 1st of May happened, was just 4 days before the election itself. So people had a holiday, and so the whole day in certain parks were turned into a festival, full of Pakatan colors, and Pakatan leaders would turn up now and then, and Pakatan rock bands. That's part of it as well. So during the day they would be playing. And one thing that I found interesting was at one of the early rallies, the DAP, where was this? In Skudai, I think, had a rally that they called Rock the Vote, actually. They call it Rock the Vote. And so they would have bands playing, and then the leaders would drop in whenever they could. Now this is a DAP thing, and the band for the DAP band was a pass band, a PA, really. So it was quite interesting. So you have a pass band, only Malays, playing rock music to uncles and aunties, you know. And then after that, the DAP would play, and then the leaders would drop in late in the day. This was early in the rally, but I think that atmosphere was kept up. I went up to Kluang at the end of the rally, at the campaign period, and that was maybe because Kluang isn't that congested an area. There were lots of open fields and all that, so you got that. It was easier to get that festival feeling, I think. Right. Now, we have always known that the internet and the social media have been important in Malaysian politics ever since Malaysia Kini came on the scene at the end of the 1900s, 1998. So we mustn't play that down. That is really important. And this time around, perhaps Malaysia Kini didn't play as big a role as they did 5 years ago. But that tells us something. That tells us that it has actually matured. The using of social media, Twitters, SMSs, Facebook especially, has taken over. So messages were being sent through Facebook. And the thing about Facebook compared to print media or whatever is that it's networks, right? It's networks of so-called friends connecting with networks of other people and all that. So it happened that way, and a lot of the information was actually spread that way. And the discussion would go on all day because people would place their comments, you know, on internet endlessly. And of course, in Johor, a lot of it is actually placed in Mandarin. That, I think, was a very, very important, very actively used medium that I don't think the BN actually mastered, really. Anyway, it's never cool to be the government. It's always cool to be the opposition. Another thing to notice, for a political scientist watching these elections, is that how little issues were discussed. This goes back to I think that what I said earlier, that this is the end of a 4-year campaign. Everything's been said, I think, and so at rallies, when late at night, it wouldn't be about issues. It would be shouting of "Ini Kalila," and the crowd would shout "Uba," whatever. Wu ye wu, you know, it's sort of okay, festival-like, but more ritualized in that sense. It wasn't about discussing issues, and I think all that was because it had all been discussed and the positions were quite clear. There seemed to have been a lot of vote buying as well. Not so clearly in Johor, but up in Penang, I think that it was happening quite openly. A lot of the people were invited to BN dinners and whatever, and you were actually paid money to go there. And once you entered the door, you weren't allowed to leave until the speakers had finished. And so some of those got wise and would just stay outside the barricade, have their dinner, but stay outside the door. So they could leave when they wanted to. So that I would say that this buying through that way has quite a limited effect in the urban areas especially. People were just going for a free dinner. In Penang, they were really throwing money about, the BN. They were buying up all the hawkers who on a good night might make 1,000 ringgit or something, right, really working hard. But here comes BN and gives them 1,000 or even more, and just to buy them up so that they will sell their food for free that whole evening. And that way the BN would get the crowd. And of course they know the Penangites. I was up in Penang one night. They go wherever the food is, right? So, and also you get all the best hawkers put in a certain place where they're going to go for good food. You know? So they follow where the hawkers go. And those hawkers who were not picked, of course, voted for the opposition. You know what I mean? There's a double-edged sword. Okay, what else? Yeah, so there was a color war going on. I think in certain towns, in Kluang, it was very clear because they had good, huge food courts and coffee shops. And the thing about using colors like green and yellow and red is that what other colors do we have on T-shirts, you know? So it doesn't have to be an opposition T-shirts. People are still wearing those colors. So once the association is made that if you're wearing one of these bright colors, you're somehow a Pakatan supporter, I think that added to the street, the feeling on the street that the support is wider than it actually was. While the BN on their part, where visibility was concerned, of course, had only blue. Right, it was quite clear. It's either blue or all the other colors. And they made up for it by putting up many flags. In Penang, the flags were like a fence. And from what I hear, why it was like that was that it was outsourced. So every flag cost 8 ringgit, I think. So, you know, you take 8,000 of this and you're not going to go all over the place and someone might shout at you because this is opposition territory. So it would all be put along one street or on a fence. I mean, really, I don't have a picture of it, but I'm sure they're actually tight, so you can't even see through them. And every one of them costs $8 to put up, you know. So the amount of money being thrown about was quite ridiculous. And in the case of Penang, we can see that there was no effect. The Pakatan still got 2/3. Huh? So this money buying, vote buying thing has, I think, in the urban areas had very little effect. One other point I would make. Well, I think the swing, as I mentioned, between the first week and the second week, I think the swing sort of, and I suppose it's psychological, it increases exponentially in Johor Bahru area, where at first people are curious and they're just there, you know, because the neighbor is going or whatever. But I think the crowd suddenly went up, and I suppose the psychology is that it goes into the family, right? So the family thinks, perhaps it's just one person, and then the family thinks, it's all right, we can all go. And then through Facebook and all that, I think it increases exponentially. That would be how I explain why the crowds became so enormous at the end. They were really big at the end. Where was this? Yeah, I flew up to Penang, breaking my stay in Johor, just for a while. And it's just enormous. It's quite, you had to park your car 2 miles away just to attend, you know. I think even the speakers had trouble getting there. Now, one point I would make about Johor, of course, is that this is part of a continuing strategy on the part of the opposition. So I think they had been talking since 2-3 years ago about the possibility of going into Johor, which is understandable looking at the results from 2008. Most of the swing happened in the north, in the urban areas. Practically nothing south of Negeri Sembilan. Right? And so, of course, all the strategies would, of course, what's wrong with Johor, but they were still tentative about it until very late in the day, and then the DAP, of course, went down, led by Kit Siang. And so it's sort of an attack into Johor territory, but I think it's more specific than just against BN. It was actually against the MCA. Right? Everyone knows since 5 years ago that the MCA was really on its back foot. It couldn't get a new leadership going. It couldn't renew itself. To the extent that the president of the party couldn't even run for office. And they had to loan out 3 seats, I think, to BN. And all that was, of course, very embarrassing for MCA leaders. And we also saw it when Kit Siang went down to Gelang Patah to challenge the MCA, and the MCA immediately backed off and got UMNO to fight for them instead. All that, of course, lost them a lot of face. And I think that, I'm sure that added to the defeat that the BN suffered in Gelang Patah. So seen only in that narrow sense of a DAP strategy going into Johor, it was rather successful. And I suppose whether one wants to talk racial politics or not, the basic supporter, the normal supporter for the DAP is still the Chinese. And of course, for the DAP to go beyond what they achieved in 2008, it had to be the urban centers where the Chinese could be found, and that would be Johor. Right? Of course, they also tried in East Malaysia and succeeded to an extent. So they're practically as big as they possibly can be today, I think. That's one thing to think about. Running out of time. Yeah. Okay. I should stop? Okay, I'll wrap up. I'll wrap up. Certain things we should think about now when it's been 2 weeks now since the election. So in Penang and Selangor, we're talking about second-term governments now, not first-term, second-term governments. So that things will change. There will be, the honeymoon has to end sometime for them. So I think more demand from the public will be put on the governments there. We'll see how that happens. I think it's all part of this maturing process of a two-party system we're seeing here. Now we have UMNO as the biggest party, followed by, in second, third, fourth place, the opposition. That's the picture we have today. So apart from UMNO, we have only BN parties that are rather small, except for Taib's, I suppose. But even that is quite far down in numbers. Yeah. So that's a new thing. The urban-rural divide, I think, whatever one puts into it, it's quite clear now, especially with the fall of Kedah back to BN. You see that the opposition is very strong in urban areas, and then Kelantan by Kelantan has another dynamic, I think. So that I think is quite clear, and that's going to continue. And we also saw that the popular vote actually went to the opposition, but they still did not take government. And so a lot of discussions, I think, going forward will be about the malapportionment, of course. I think they started already. And because it's about the election system, the Bersih movement, I think, will also be growing strong in the coming months. We see now that the BN is strong only in Johor, Sabah, Sarawak, and that is reflected in the cabinet that was announced last week. Right. I think I'll stop there. I'll run on there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kee Bing. Over to you, Meredith.
So first of all, I do want to thank Kee Bing and, well, everyone else here as well, but for allowing me to spend this time at ICES, which has been incredibly productive, and also to join this panel, which is fun. It's nice to be in a place in which lots of people actually care about elections in Malaysia. What I will present today will be very narrowly focused. This is the first unveiling of some of the findings from a broad project that I'm doing in conjunction with Ed Aspinall, Alan Hicken, and Paul Hutchcroft on electoral dynamics broadly. So in other words, how do candidates seek to attract votes? What are their strategies? What are their messages? What are their promises? How are campaigns structured? But also specifically on the structure and nature of political networks and patronage flows. So we're loosely calling this money politics. We're looking at Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand. What I'll present today is derived from field research findings, mostly from our 50-plus research assistants in Malaysia, most of whom are postgraduate students in Malaysia, one of whom is a bright young visiting regular staff fellow here at ICES. So if she's in the audience, perhaps she can speak at some point. Also, I'll add into this my own observations and findings from our interviews and so forth as we traveled all around Malaysia during the campaign. The RAs, just so you'll have some sense of this, were tasked with being assigned to one district. We had generally 2 districts per state. We oversampled a little bit in Sabah, and for instance in Perlis we could only cover 1 parliamentary district. But within that district they were asked to interview all candidates, or as many as would speak with them, from all federal and state seats, to interview campaign staff from every campaign, to meet with some local experts or journalists, to attend as many campaign events as they possibly could, and a lot of them really attended a lot of campaign events, and also just to generally observe. And so I've been, since the election, reading and listening furiously to all of what they've submitted. We're still awaiting survey data. We have commissioned a survey, which includes, for instance, a list experiment or survey experiment to try to gauge things like the prevalence of vote buying, but I won't include that because I haven't gotten the data yet. All right. So first of all, I would argue that economics are the overriding theme of this election, not ethnicity, not religion, not just a knee-jerk call for change. Economic class could be seen as the main dividing line amongst the electorate. So even when candidates or party staff defaulted to racial categories in describing the electorate, who supported them, who was opposed, they generally still subdivided those breakdowns by class. Merdeka Center surveys in the prolonged lead-up showed a consistent plurality of respondents who emphasized economic issues, especially the cost of living, but also things like corruption and so forth, above all. Inasmuch as economic issues or economic interests are key, those are more clearly determined by occupational or class position than by ethnicity. So in that sense, if this shift holds, if these sorts of interests become the dominant dividing lines, that could signal a real change within the electorate. Preferential policies, for instance, do marginalize non-Malays. That's one of the common reasons given for why so few non-Malays seem to, especially Chinese, seem to support the BN. But they also marginalize Malays who are not in the well-connected upper echelon, let alone other Bumiputra, like the mass of Kadazan Dusun and Marut, or KDM voters in Sabah, or, for instance, the Thai minority in Perlis, who are considered to be Bumiputra but are not granted the same privileges. There is a real exception, actually two exceptions to that economic focus. One would be small parties like Berjasa, and our RA's interviews with Berjasa candidates found an absolutely unyielding emphasis on Malay supremacy and Islam. And some independent candidates also supported, for instance, just Indian rights or other very specific constituencies. The BN also stressed issues of the Chinese takeover or Islamization, depending on the audience, as well as things like support for vernacular schools or Pakistan's lack of support for vernacular schools. And both UMNO and PAS candidates did stress Islam and less often or less openly Malay rights and status in some contests. The BN in places like Sabah also made more targeted appeals. So, for instance, Hajiji in Tuaran, in the state city of Sulaiman, noted in sequence first to a Bugis crowd that Najib is Bugis, and so therefore they should support him, and then to a KDM crowd that his wife is KDM, so they also should support him. Okay. And indeed, some areas had really pressing different local issues. So the Linus plant in Kuantan, the undocumented migrants, the PTI or the Royal Commission issue in Sabah, issues of temporary occupancy licenses versus permanent land tenure in places like the Cameron Highlands and Darao, land issues also really everywhere, but those were really salient in places like Titiwangsa and KL, where you have both Kampung Baru and Kampung Pandan, as well as Sarawak, issues related to agriculture in places like the Cameron Highlands, and of course oil royalties in Sabah, Kelantan, and Terengganu in particular. What was particularly interesting to the way those local issues played out was the extent to which those encouraged coalition politics rather than supporting local parties that emphasize those local issues specifically. A lot of those issues require a change at the federal level. So things like autonomy or oil royalties for Sabah requires not voting for SAPP or STAR, the local parties that were all about states' rights, Sabah for the Sabahans, but the DAP could convincingly argue, and their progress suggests that it was convincing, that rather interest in those issues would mandate voting for a party that has a chance of winning in Putrajaya so that those large federalist issues could be renegotiated. While the underlying issue is individuals' cost of living and prospects, for instance, though, some Pakistan speakers in particular very effectively linked corruption and mismanagement on a broad scale to the personal level, thus justifying populist subsidies. That said, I would definitely agree with Ki Beng that a lot of the trauma did just default to these sorts of call and response. And I think perhaps because of the fear trauma, when they tried doing similar call and response things, the voters sometimes got it wrong. There were complex multi-part call and response, and people would get confused. All right, so there's this sort of economic focus. Money factors, though, in other ways than just what people were voting for. Most obviously, the cost of the campaign. This was an extraordinarily expensive campaign. We will never know how expensive. There are, the Election Commission sets limits of 100,000 ringgit that can be spent per state seat and 200,000 for parliament, but they do very little to enforce that. We heard that from candidates on all sides. Moreover, there's little, if any, documentation of funds that come in. So, for instance, Pakistan mostly gets donations, but there are also these ostensibly non-political groups like the One Malaysia Welfare Club in Penang, which several candidates in Penang from Gerakan and MCA said not just rallies support through all those free dinners and concerts, but also donates cash to their campaigns. So it'd be near impossible to assess how much had been spent. But for instance, that one Malaysia club spent, according to the president, almost 4 million ringgit on one concert for over 80,000 voters in Tanjung. Well, they weren't all voters from Tanjung, probably. But that doesn't even include performers' fees that were waived, donations, and so forth. And yet, the club president was perplexed at the fact that people were annoyed at having their ICs photocopied as they entered the venue. Okay. The largest, I thought I had one of the stockade flags in Penang on here, but I don't. But the largest expense, most said, was printing posters, buntings, and flags, though especially for the BN, a lot of those were provided by the Central Party machinery. Next in line in terms of expenses seemed to be food for campaign workers. Workers were generally given at least a transportation allowance if they weren't paid, at least for the BN. Pakatan sometimes offered a transportation allowance, something like 30 ringgit for petrol, but more often their staff were fully volunteers, so they only got food, which is why the food was important. Some places, like the PSM office in Sungai Siput, said that food was sponsored by their supporters. But it's not just the flags. The trauma were expensive too, especially with this trend toward the sort of celebrity speakers, whether from their own party or coalition or elsewhere. So it's an important way to signal that the coalition had merit. So for instance, Pakatan would bring in speakers from each of the coalition partners to show that there is some there. But other times it was just big names like Ambika Srinivasan, mostly at Pakatan Trauma, or Umi Hafilda, who made a reappearance to speak in various places in Sabah. The one BN leader in Jerlun, for instance, said the top speakers at Pentrama can cost up to 2,000 ringgit, and otherwise you can expect to pay each of them at least 100 ringgit. No one in Pakatan mentioned honoraria or other payments for speakers at these trauma except transport, and that could be expensive. So, for instance, we did hear discussions of helicopters that ferried Anwar around in Sabah. There are other expenses for everything from catered dinners, though Pakatan sold tickets for those, to song and dance cultural shows and sari contests and so forth, to a fully stocked press and media center that was run by a businessman close to Shahidan Qasim in Arau, to lucky draws for all sorts of good stuff, to transport allowances for voters. So in Lumut, for instance, our trustee RAs got a breakdown of the amount you were given depended on where you were coming from. So it was 200 ringgit if you came from KL, down to 10 ringgit if you were coming locally on your own wheels. Other places seem to be a flat rate of around 20 or 30 ringgit per voter who bothered to take this slip over to the BN tent to get paid for having shown up at the polls. Some independent candidates did try to run their campaign on less than 10,000 ringgit. So, for instance, Chiam Mai Chu, who's a Green candidate in Cameron Highlands, had a self-funded budget of 10,000 ringgit. Burjasa candidate, one of them in Cameron Highlands, for instance, said that he was planning to go with just 7,000 or 8,000. Some seemed very cagey, which isn't that surprising, or just really clueless as to the costs. A realistic, low-budget, very low-budget, independent or third-party campaign, or some for Pakatan, seem to be in around the 30,000 to 40,000 ringgit range, with some unquantifiable additional amount of in-kind donations, of food, of space, of chairs, and so forth, and some materials plus a deposit often given by the party hierarchy. Some Pakatan campaigns, though, admitted to hitting the EC limit. So PAS and Tidiwangsa said they were, at the time our RA spoke with them, close to 200,000 already. There was, though, a universal agreement, which was just terribly obvious anyway, that the BN fence far beyond that, mostly funded by the state or federal level party staff. So, for instance, candidates and staff from all states said that the party channeled funds that seemed to be equivalent to the EC limits, 100,000 and 200,000, to each candidate, plus supplied a lot of the material they needed, like flags. We have in this project yet to get deeply into the question of where those party funds come from, and none of our respondents could or would say. One very frank candidate, or the PA to a candidate to Palanivel in Cameron Highlands, said he had budgeted almost 1 million ringgit. My guess is that's a misstatement, either that or he's just far too frank for his job. Pakatan was mostly funded by donations, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Candidates, though, did get funds from the party. Most said somewhere around 10,000 to 20,000, though some, for instance, state seats in Penang, said it was just about 5,000. The Keadilan party's divisive alliance with the APS and PPS in Sabah was reportedly because those candidates, Wilfred Bumburung and Lajim Ukin, were rich enough that they didn't require Pakatan funds. Small businesses were increasingly supportive, which seems to be a real shift, though some of them still hedged bets and gave to all sides. So, for instance, in Kuala Rus and Terengganu, businesses tended to give anonymously to Pakatan, to PAS mostly. So there was no chance of being seen to expect some sort of payback. Elsewhere, like in Alor Gajah and Lumut, businesses were thought to give anonymously because they had to be seen publicly giving support to MCA or Gerakan or UMNO. Keadilan in Alor Gajah, one state seat there, doesn't accept business sponsors at all since it won't provide privileges and it doesn't want that ambiguity. Elsewhere in Kuantan, for instance, Keadilan's Fuzia Saleh said she'll accept donations but is adamant about there not being a quid pro quo. Then you have other sort of frank people like Lajim Ukin in Beaufort in Sabah who just said that, yes, he will direct contracts toward those supporters, just not on so massive a scale as BN does. The main support, though, seems to be individual cash and in-kind donations through donation boxes at Bilik Gerakan or Makaz, or trauma collections, sale of tickets to dinners, T-shirts, books, and other merchandise. We even heard reports from more than one place of livestock donated for the Kenduri, so cows and sheep. And most candidates, including from the BN, said that they supplemented with their own funds or funds from friends and family. So I would argue that that may shut out increasingly third parties and poor candidates. It's increasingly hard to compete with the level of advertising by the BN, for instance, and the flags and so forth. And there's also just the sheer number of events requires a pretty large staff. So Pakatan, for instance, for Pakatan, Anwar apparently required at least 9 programs a day. So those could be prayers at different mosques, walkabouts, trauma, and so forth. And then the BN, but also PAS, for instance, had very strong women's wings that were sometimes called Jalinan Rakyat, sometimes just the Wanita, sometimes the Perayu Undi, or otherwise called, who survey the area starting long before the election. They monitor voters' concerns on an ongoing basis. They ensure support for the party. They'll go for daily visits if necessary. They'll provide services if needed. They bring voters to important ceramah. So, for instance, each JR was directed to bring at least 30 people to hear Muhyiddin speak in Kangar, I guess to justify the big banner we saw saying, welcoming Muhyiddin, the 7th Prime Minister of Malaysia, to Kangar. And then they were supposed to get them to the polls. In Arau, for instance, there were also separate events just for the JR at which the top party leaders spoke. They were assured there of pelinchir, of grease for the wheels of transport money for themselves. In terms of how many flags, which was a question one couldn't help asking in traveling around Malaysia, one BN candidate in a state seat in Lumut said the BN was able to economize by printing over 10 million flags in bulk. So I would believe that, but how to compete? But even then, BN candidates and campaign workers even complained about the waste, the obstruction to traffic, and so forth that these caused. So what to make of all this? I would argue that this difference in funding mechanisms suggests that the funding through donations represents a fundamentally different model. It may be born out of the necessity of funding a campaign on the cheap, but it has come to define the parties in a key way. For one thing, it suggests a solidity of support. Candidates and party workers routinely marveled at how much they had collected from donations at ceramah. They would announce the amount for a greater performative effect, a bandwagon effect. It must be a great party if so many are willing to give. So the amounts we heard varied from one ceramah, a small one in Padang Sarai, 649 ringgit and 70 sen, to over 100,000 when Lim Kit Siang and Karpal Singh spoke in Tanjong. Some savvy people in the BN did the same. So Khairi Jamaluddin in Rambau, for instance, noted that he wants support from small businesses and NGOs because that serves, as in his words, as a third-party validation that he's worth supporting. Others in the BN were dismissive of such efforts. So, for instance, one UMNO candidate in Alor Gajah, Malacca, said, UMNO is not looking for donations. We are an established foundation. And somebody else from the small party Kita said that they are not a beggar party. Liu Chin Tong of the DAP in Kluang gloated also over tens of thousands of ringgit that had been gained from sales in their mini shops, plus of the merchandise that you heard about from Kibang, of T-shirts, books, stuffed toys, hornbill hats, and so forth at trauma. The MCA did try selling stuffed pandas, but we had this sort of mournful line from one of our RAs that 3 boxes remained unsold after what was supposed to be a big trauma in Johor. Okay. So it's not just free advertising and endorsements when people wear those shirts and pay for the privilege. Okay, the BN gives out all of these things, and Pakatan candidates told us of free food going on eaten at BN events, since even that wasn't enough to lure the crowd. And meanwhile, there's this youth fashion of being not afraid to flaunt these sorts of leanings. Anonymous donations are especially salient, though. There's all the more discursive power in being able to say not just that one would not give preference to those donors, but that you could not because you don't know who they are. It implies that those giving their donations have not just their own, see themselves as having not just particularistic self-interest at stake, but a general interest to getting the party into office. That's come to factor into the identity of the party. It's a point of pride among PAS, for instance, that they took just a small contribution from the party, then kept their budget in check, and raised funds and material from supporters, and that creates a real distinction from UMNO, even when some of the policies can be quite similar, or the candidate profiles are similar. Okay? And so they started saying things like, it's our culture. There's also the practical matter of donated human power for the campaign. Students were important to this election, especially where you had former lecturers, for instance, running. Bercy helped to mobilize quite a lot of people. Mama Bercy rallied the troops, Ambiga spoke at Sharma, and so forth. So, in short, there's been a shift from expecting handouts, or at least the so-called makan politics of a free meal, to a very different ethos in which you get nothing and even pay for the privilege of taking part, sometimes with no one really even knowing about it, no selective incentive to encourage you. And yet, it was Pakistan that still drew the massive crowds. I won't have time to get through all of this that I've sketched. But so in terms of vote buying, one of the things we were trying to gauge was how much is just the price of admission and what's beyond the pale. So a lot is taken for granted. One of these things was the incredible amount of what we'll loosely call literature. And then also a certain amount of free food seems unavoidable, though it's a lot more of that is from the BN, and on the Pakistan side it was more often sponsored. One Garakan candidate in Cameron Highlands just said, eating makes people happy, and then it is easier to request for anything. Okay. But water bottles and so forth were endemic, and you saw more of them on the BN, but PAS had theirs as well. There was, for instance, an open house beer tent from one of the UPCO candidates in Tuaran. Saw a lot of sacks of rice ranging from 5 to 15 kilos for the poor, for the old, for the sick, or just for anyone. And then there were these other sort of hard-to-reproach gifts, like wheelchairs and adult diapers that Nurul Izzah gave out, or school equipment and things like that. Quite a bit of pro bono legal and medical care, often extending throughout the period and not just during the campaign. Service centers were especially key in showing not just that the party's doing something, but that also that this is a candidate who will turun pandang, who will go out and be amongst the people. Tons and tons of party swag, T-shirts, hats, clappers, air freshener, umbrellas, and so forth. Pakistan generally sells. BN provides a lot for free. Cultural performances, line dances, comedians, fireworks, dancers, karaoke, and so forth, as well as quite a lot spent on transport. So petrol for party workers and so forth, buses to bring voters up to Perak from Singapore, fleets of taxis for polling day. All of those seem not to be read as vote buying, but rather as just what one has to do to be in the game. There are sometimes blunt handouts, though. These did seem to have diminished. So, for instance, there's a 5 ringgit note that all attendees at a dinner on the eve of nomination day got in Aral. There are bags of goodies or hampers, sometimes to poor voters, sometimes to anyone who attended an event. Places like Kuching and Cebu and Sarawak, for instance, both Bercy and candidates themselves said there are fewer incidents after the calamitous state elections in 2011, fewer incidents of vote buying, and the BN parties were trying to be absolutely clean, at least within the urban areas. But there were expectations in some areas that the BN would go in late at night in the last few nights and go house to house and try to lure the parents, even if the kids were more Pakistan inclined. So the response by Pakistan, take the money and vote your conscience. Others seemed just to lack the funds more than the will. So a Keadilan candidate in Katere and Kelantan said, even if we wanted to give money, we could not give. We don't have funds. Not a strong commitment there. There was the dubious legality of launching big projects during the campaign. So in Galang Patan, Johor, for instance, Abdul Ghani delivered an assistance scheme for farmers, street lamps, the land title for a Hindu temple, and a new building for a Chinese school, something for everyone. There was a launch of a 60 million ringgit bridge in Kuala Penyu in Sabah, plus reminders of all these other goodies had been given, and a number of reports from Cameron Highlands and elsewhere of micro-enterprise loans being given through the Tekun Nasional program, and also BRIM handouts. So those had been going on before, but those continued during the campaign, even though they weren't supposed to be given out by the party, they're from the government, but they were in many cases, and they weren't supposed to be handed out during the campaign, but they were in a number of cases. But lastly, just to wrap up very quickly, it's not so clear that these much larger scale lures worked well. For those voters for whom the marginal impact of 500 ringgit or a promise of 1,200 ringgit, as some candidates were saying, from BRIM made a real difference in their lives, especially if it came with a Dachshund, a BN logo attached, things like BRIM may have actually helped. But the larger scale efforts that were made, so for instance, Raja Nongchik's incredible effort to show how much he had basically bought for Lembah Pantai as Federal Territories Minister, he didn't win in Lembah Pantai, even though Nurul Izzah had quite the different approach of, on her sort of main handout, the #1 item she lists is not what she did for the district, but that she introduced 5 private member bills in Parliament. Another good indication of the fact that the big buyouts don't necessarily work is in Kuching, in which both Vincent Lau and Sibu, both of these timber and palm oil tycoons lost to both of their opponents were 30-something DAP pharmacists. Even though, for instance, we trailed Vincent Lau as he went around promising hundreds of thousands of ringgit to rebuild community halls and so forth. And then lastly, I'll conclude with just a kind of funny bit, which is that some One Malaysia projects may not have worked out as planned. So the PAS campaign staff in Padang Serai said, we should thank Najib for giving One Malaysia notebooks to the kids here so they can surf the internet and inform their parents. Okay. So in other words, we did see some basically meso-particularistic appeals, these gifts that were given to a constituency, or micro-particularistic appeals, basically vote buying or gifts to an individual, making a difference. But overall, when there were policies touted, they tended to be much more programmatic ones. And for both sides, not so much on race-based lines. BRIM is not a race-based program, it's need-based. But rather, there seems to be perhaps a shift toward more programmatic appeals, programmatic policies that are being promised, but we still have to see what actually results from those promises after the campaign.
Thank you very much, Meredith, for that very insightful presentation. I'd like to hand over to James, who will talk to us about Sarawak.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. I'll quickly go through Sarawak with time running out on this. I spent the second wave of the campaign in Sarawak, and I did follow a couple of candidates, both from the government and the opposition. And I just want to give you a very brief summary of what I saw. But I think it's important we put it within the larger context first. The first is what was at stake in Sarawak. Sarawak had 31 seats, and I think that's extremely important, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes. In 2008, Barisan won 30 of the 31 seats. And DAP only won the only other seat, and that was in Bandar Kuching. But they picked up a second seat in the by-election in Bandar Sibu in 2010 when the sitting incumbent MP from Barisan Nasional, Robert Lau, died of cancer. The results of 2013 was quite interesting. Barisan took 25, and Pakatan Rakyat took 6 seats. The party that lost all the seats to the opposition was actually SUPP. SUPP stood for 7 seats, and they lost 6, and they only won 1 seat. Now, what is interesting about SUPP, as most of you know, is that SUPP supposedly supposed to represent the Chinese community in Sarawak. And the only seat they won was in Syrian, which is a Bidayu area. So in other words, they can no longer claim to speak on behalf of the Chinese. And that's the reason why for the past 4 years I've been saying that SUPP stands for the Sarawak Unhappy People's Party. So, okay. Right, let's look at the results in further detail. You can see that for almost all the parties, right, except for SUPP, right, the success rate was 100%, which is quite remarkable. PBB, the backbone of the Sarawak Barisan Nasional, Berbera Bersatu, stood for 14 seats and they won 14 seats. So they were the big winner. SUPP was the big loser. PRS, SPDP, they all had 100% success rate. PKR turned out to be the big loser as well, big loser number 2. Out of the 15 seats, they only won 1 seat, and that was in Miri, Chinese majority seat, although they were targeting mostly the mixed areas and the Bumiputera areas. DAP was the big winner. Out of 11 seats, they won 5, close to 50%. PAS was basically no hope, and the rest really no hope. STAR, which stands for Saya Tak Ada Rambut. SWP, which is a new party set up just before the elections in order to split the die vote, also came up with 0, and of course independent. Oh, by the way, all the independents lost the deposit, so that gives you an idea of where the party stands in Sarawak. Now, why is East Malaysia important? I think this is an extremely important point that a lot of people have missed out, and that's the reason is because of the margin of victory. Barisan's margin of victory was 21 seats, 133, if you minus 112, right? And Sarawak alone contributed 25 seats. In other words, without the MPs from Sarawak, Najib will not be sitting in Putrajaya today. Okay? PBB alone account for 14 seats. So as a reward, you can see that when the cabinet was announced last week, PBB had 4 full ministers plus deputy ministers. And if you look at the cabinet list, Senarai cabinet, 20 of the full and deputy ministers all came from East Malaysia. In terms of stats, it's really interesting. If you look at UMNO plus PBB, they constitute 77% of Barisan Nasional. If you count Sarawak Barisan into the mix, they count for 85% of Barisan Nasional. If you count UMNO and East Malaysia together, they account for more than 90% of Barisan Nasional. And East Malaysia alone accounts for 35%. So basically, the government that you see today in Putrajaya is actually East Malaysian government. East Malaysia plus plus. Okay. Now, in terms of the new voters, there was approximately 264,000 new voters. And what is interesting was that the bulk of it, 60%, was between the ages of 21 and 50. Now, before the elections, if you had spoken to the people from the Pakatan Raya, you'll find that they were very gung-ho. They were very, very gung-ho about East Malaysia. As Kiban mentioned, their targets were Johor and East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak. And in Sarawak, they were targeting up to 15 seats. So why were they so gung-ho? The first, of course, was Taib Mahmud. I mean, the best quotation I heard during the whole election was that in Sarawak, when he spoke to the DAP leader, he said that we don't have to campaign because Taib Mahmud is doing all the campaigning for us. By simply being there, he represents all that is rotten and corrupt about the Barisan Nasional. Second, of course, was the famous Global Witness video in which his first cousin was saying nasty things about the natives of Sarawak. That video is still floating around YouTube. And of course, they were very confident because they thought that in the rural areas, it was penetrated by a thing called Radio Free Sarawak. Radio Free Sarawak is a Iban or native language independent radio station that used to be based in London, now is based near Sarawak. That broadcasts every night from 7 to 10 o'clock at night. So the idea is that they want to use the Radio Free Sarawak to reach all the rural areas. They were also confident because the Iban vote was split. Because just before the election, there was a new party that came out, Sarawak Workers' Party, and that party was specially set up to split the direct vote. So they thought that, with another party into the mix, they had a very good chance. And of course, it had split in the two Barisan party. SUPP was split between the Fujiaos of Cebu and Kuching and Miri combined together. So there were two big factions in the SUPP. And in fact, the situation got so bad that they did not attend each other's functions. You also had split in SPDP, which is between the leader William Mawar and another group led by Tiki. And of course, yes, internet and social media, because in the amount of chattering on the internet, you thought that, wow, something is going to happen in Sarawak. And of course, they were all taken in by the big crowds and big donations, as Meredith mentioned, in places like Kuching, Stamping, They had really, really huge crowds. The crowds, for the very first time, will probably reach about, in Stamping alone, I attended one rally where the crowd reaches almost 30,000, which is unheard of. And of course, the last point why they were very, very gung-ho about Sarawak was the Allah issue. Now, they thought that the Ibans and the natives of Sarawak were really, really angry about this issue. And I'm referring to the ban on the use of the word Allah. Because as you know, in Sabah and Sarawak, they've been using this even before Malaysia. Right, in terms of the competitive seats, at the start of the campaign, I spoke to very senior people in Barisan Nasional. They told me they've identified 13 areas as grey areas. And I'll quickly go through the areas. This was Mas Gading, Stamping, Sri Amang, Lubuk Antu, Seratok, Serike, Julau, Lanan, Sibu, Selangau, Miri, Barang, and Limbang. At the end of the second week, right, out of the 13 grey areas, only 7 were left. And this was Mas Gading, Stamping, Seratok, Serike, Lanan, Sibu, and Miri, the red color ones. So within the space of 1 week, they managed to change 13 grey areas to 7, which is not a bad record. About 50% they managed to turn over. Okay, and I'll go through all the hot seats, why they were hot, okay? Mas Gading was a hot seat because the incumbent, Tiki Lafe, was replaced. Tiki Lafe is interesting because he was fighting against the party president, and he was also the chair of the National Service Commission in Malaysia, and he wanted to be a direct BN candidate. The other reason why it was a hot seat was that because the former MP for the area was standing as well, Patrick Anak Orang. Stamping was a hot seat because the incumbent Deputy Minister, Yong Kun Seng, refused to stand initially. In fact, 1 year before, he went around, gave a lot of press interviews saying that I want to retire, I've been sitting here for 5 terms, I need to spend more time with my grandchildren, all that sort of thing. But at the last minute, he was forced to stand by Najib because he was deemed as a winnable candidate. Of course, he lost. P202, Sri Aman, Interesting seat because you had two very strong opponents. One, of course, was a guy called Nicholas Munja, who's been working on NCR issues for a very long time. But more importantly, there was an interesting independent candidate by the name of Donald Lawan. Those of you who followed Sarawak politics will know that this guy is interesting. He has actually won a seat previously in Sri Amang. He was the MP, he was a state assemblyman, the YB for Bukit Bangunan. And he is the son, his son is the existing YB for that area. So he was a very, very strong candidate. On top of that, the incumbent BN candidate, Masih Kujat, Donald Lawang was his campaign manager in the last round. So people thought that Donald Lawang was going to put up a very, very big fight. And of course, the other one was the Sarawak Workers' Party, Wilfred, who was not a serious candidate. So people thought that Nicholas and Donald Lawang, one of these will win the seat over Masih. But in fact, it didn't happen. Lubok Antu, interesting, hot seat, because the president of the Sarawak Workers' Party, Larry Singh, who used to be a deputy minister, was standing on that seat. Plus, you had another strong NCR person by the name of Nicholas Bowing. And people thought that Larry was going to spend big because as president of the party, he needed to win a seat. So people thought that Lubok Antu was hot. Suratok was hot because the existing candidate, Jaliam Masat, was dropped. And he was replaced by the president, William Mawan. And the reason why it was hot was because his opponent was a guy called Ali Biju, who 3 years earlier in 2011 had won the state seat of Korean. So people thought that Ali Biju could galvanize the crowd. Again, you can see that Lubok Antu was and Suratok was hot seat because Najib had to come personally to rally the troops on April the 27th. Sri K was hot seat because in 2008, the incumbent candidate only won by 51 votes. And his opponent this time was a guy called Andrew Won, who used to be also in the same party as UPP, and in fact, he was a political secretary to the YB for Report, which is in the Sri K area. Okay. Jula was a hot seat because of the candidate Wan Judat, who was a former state assemblyman, and also the incumbent was a guy called Joseph Salang, who was regarded as not a very strong candidate because he didn't bring a lot of development to the Jula area. Lanan, this is the seat that Meredith was talking about. The SUPP candidate was Tiong Tai King. He's a tycoon from Remanang Hijau, and interestingly enough, he was also the mayor of Cebu. His candidate was a lady called Alice Lau, second time around. And what is interesting about her was that her father is a very strong BN supporter. In Cebu, the DAP, as I mentioned, won in 2010 in the by-election because the incumbent MP had died. But this time, interestingly enough, the DAP winner in 2010, Won Holian, also did not stand for health reasons, and he was replaced by his political secretary, Oscar Ling. The SUPP's candidate was a guy called Temongong Vincent Lau. More importantly, it's not so much that he's a Temongong, but he's a tycoon and he represents the KTS group. Basically, in Cebu politics, right, there's three huge business houses, the three tycoons, and each of them control one part of Cebu. So the idea was that Lanang will be controlled by RH and Cebu will be controlled by the KTS group. Selangau, interesting seat, hot, because Seng Chihua, Larry Sing's father, was standing there, and people thought that he was going to spend a lot of money as well. Miri was hot seat because the SUPP incumbent Peter Ching was forced to step down in favor of his political secretary, Sebastian Tin. Initially, everyone thought that the DAP would put out a candidate, but because of internal split in DAP, they did not manage to put out a candidate. They wanted a lady by name Eunice Lim, but she was rejected by DAP Miri because she was born and she comes from Bintulu. So in the end, because of the symbol issue, right, in the end, in fact, it was at the very, very last minute, she was replaced by PKR's Dr. Michael Teo. Baram, hot seat because of the dams. There's going to build a new dam in Cebu, and a lot of natives that are very unhappy, and also they're very unhappy over the native land issue, the NCR issue. And they were so unhappy over there that the Barisan actually dropped the incumbent candidate, was replaced. And PKR put out an Orang Ulu lawyer who specialized in NCR issue, Ronald, to go against the BN in Baram. And finally, in Limbang, Limbang became a hot seat because the PKR chief at Bacalalan State Assembly, Barubian, was standing there. Okay, so those are the summary of all the hot seats. Now, if you look at the results, again, coming back to this issue of urban-rural divide, what is very clear is that all the urban areas swing to the opposition, with the exception of Bintulu. And you can see the margin of victory was very, very clear. In Kuching was like 19,000, in Stamping was 18,000. The only odd one out was Sri K, 505 votes. But Lanang was like 8,000, Cebu 2,000, nearly 3,000. Miri was close to 2,000. And in Bintulu, which was won by the Barisan candidate, the margin was 7,500. The Bintulu BN candidate won because he had a very, very strong service center there. This guy is actually a guy called Tiong Kiu Sing. I don't know whether you've heard of him. He's famous because he's, how should I put it, he's one of the major players in the Portland free trade zone corruption case. He's allegedly, well, according to, depends on who you believe, he's the one who's been giving out millions of dollars to the Barisan National. And he's also the BN Backbenchers Club chairman, okay? He's very, very strong in Bintulu, and yeah, basically he used money to win elections. Okay, now, one of the things that the Pakatan always says is that they are making a headway in Sarawak because the rural vote is slowly heading their way. But if you look at the statistics more closely, right, this does not appear to be the case. If you look at the seats with less than 10% majority, right, you only find that there's about 5 seats. And out of the 5 seats, 3 are actually in urban areas. Only 2 seats, Serato and Baram, where the majority is less than 10%. So in fact, it is not true that Pakatan is making any headway, statistically at least, in the rural areas. Okay. So what are the reasons why Pakatan, or sorry, not Pakatan, PAS and PKR did not do well in the urban areas? I think the first one you can't escape if you talk about Sabah and Sarawak, of course, is geography and logistics. The state is so huge. I usually show people a map of Malaysia as a whole, and I keep reminding people that Sabah and Sarawak, in terms of land area, is actually bigger than Peninsular Malaysia. Okay? If you look at the parliamentary constituencies where you need helicopters to campaign, you're talking about at least 15 seats. Now, helicopters are important because without helicopters in these huge areas, right, you can basically visit at most, 2 longhouses per day. Otherwise, it's just impossible. So if you look at places like Santubong, Mambong, Batan Lupa, Lubuk Antu, Bentong, all this, you need a helicopter. And basically in Sarawak, right, the helicopter goes for about 6,000 per hour, but that's not the problem. The problem is that there's only one company in Sarawak that rents out helicopter, which is Hornbill Skyways. So yeah, well, we all know who owns that company. So another example of why geography and logistics play such an important role, you can see I've also put down the sort of things that the Election Commission actually went out to rent. That gives you an idea how difficult it is. For the government itself, they needed to rent 777 boats. This is not the Boeing, this is the boat. They needed to rent 53 speedboats. They needed to rent 4,600 four-wheel drives. They needed to hire 27 helicopters, plus 2 fixed-wing aircraft. This is just on the Election Commission's part. Okay, so you can imagine how difficult it is if you don't control the logistics. Second reason, of course, is that PKR, especially PKR among the Pakatan, right, did not really plan properly. They had no real political machinery to speak of. Everything depended on the party leader, Barobian. You know, he thought that the church, because he's a senior pastor in the Orang Ulu Church, he thought that the church would come on his side. That did not happen. This is the really sad part about the PKR campaign. They did not really plan the machinery properly in Sarawak, even though they were warned way, way back in 2009 that they need to set up proper machinery. And in his own individual case, he chose the wrong seat. He could never have won Limban because 40% of the Limban voters are Muslim voters. These are, you know, these are Brunei Malays and you know, and the Muslim voters, and they were never ever going to abandon the PBB. So yeah, so that's the main reason why he lost in Limbang. The other reason was money politics. All the Temonggongs and all the Ketua Kampongs received a huge pay rise in the middle of the campaign. For example, Temenggong, if I'm not mistaken, their allowance from the government was raised by 70 to 80%. Interestingly enough, unlike Meredith, my own research in Cebu showed that there was a gambling factor. There was a kopitiam in Cebu that actually started a gambling ring. The way it was quite simple. The payout was something like 10 to 15 to 1 against the Barisan. So the idea was reverse voting. There were some cash handouts as well, depending on where you were. In the rural areas, there's one particular place, one particular longhouse, I was told, from quite a semi-reliable source, as usual. They were given 1,000 per bilik. The smallest amount I saw was in Satok, where people were given 30 ringgit. So there was lots of money being circulated in the system. The other important point why they did very badly in the rural areas is because there was no significant influx of young voters going back to Longhouse. So, for example, we know that there's a huge Ibang community or Dayak community living in Johor Bahru. The overwhelming bulk of them did not go back. You have to remember, it's not simply just sponsoring them back, fly to Kuching, Cebu, or Miri. The real difficult part is getting them from the towns in Cebu back to the Longhouse. And that very often the cost is bigger than the flight going back to Sarawak. Okay, so there was no significant number of them going back. And of course, failure of one-to-one fight in some areas. So for example, as I mentioned, some of the hot seats, you can see SWP was there, some independents were there, all those diluted the votes. And it also led to a very negative perception that the opposition can't get the house in order since they can't arrange for one-to-one contest. And this was a very, very serious issue in Sabah, where at least 5 seats were lost because they did not have one-to-one contests. Social media, unlike Peninsular Malaysia, did not play a very important role. It only played an important role in the urban areas and did not really play an important role. Okay, I'll finish off. And finally, what was very interesting about this parliamentary election was that Taib Mahmud kept a very low profile. He understood that his name or his brand name is not very good, so he decided to keep a very low profile, although it did not really help in the urban areas. Okay, so in summary, the opposition stood little chance if they cannot bring young voters back to the Longhouse, if they can't control the logistics, and if they don't have enough money. Okay, but of course, I want to end off with a piece of good news. PAS has no future in Sarawak. All the candidates lost. In fact, 4 out of the 5 PAS candidates actually lost the deposit. So yeah. So thank you very much, and I'll show you a very interesting cartoon from the New York Times, which shows that the Barisan Nasional won, but badly beaten up in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for that very insightful presentation. I'll now hand over to Hock Guan, who will talk to us about some of the structural issues involved in the electoral system in Malaysia. Over to you, Hock Guan.
Good morning. Mine will be a bit quite quantitative, but just to question the rural-urban divide, it's probably more relevant when you apply it to Sabah and Sarawak, because in West Malaysia, according to the latest population and housing census 2010, urbanization in Malaysia is 70%, right? So they're left only about 30% considered rural. And if you look at Johor, which is the strongest for Barisan Nasional, especially UMNO, it's more than 80% urban. So, I mean, if that's the case, the whole idea of rural-urban divide is problematic on that count. Second is in terms of the Malay voting pattern. If you look at Kelantan, Terengganu, and Kedah, the difference between the votes, mainly Malay, for UMNO and PAS is pretty close. It's not that big. For example, Kelantan, of course, has always been won by PAS since 1990. And in Terengganu, the difference in for this case is 50% split in parliamentary seats, and BN has only 3 seats majority at the state level. So the whole idea of rural Malay divide is problematic. If you look at the voting pattern, in the Malay voting pattern in Kedah, Kelantan, and Terengganu. So anyway, so now I think the basic problem is, I mean, James, people have pointed to the problem of malapportionment. So here I'll just look at the structural design of the electoral system, which is basically uneven playing field for the opposition that the ruling coalition has sort of accumulated over the years by every 10 years they can redelineate the constituency. So you play along two things: equality of votes, and this has been diluted by malapportionment, where smaller populated areas are given equal representation to large populated areas. So I guess the worst example was in 2004, when the nation exercise created Putrajaya, which has less than 10,000 votes, about 5,000 plus. So that's of course not representative of the disproportionate, but in general you find that VN seats, especially UMNO, are much smaller than the opposition. Gerrymandering simply means you know just redraw the outline of each district, and normally you can do that in this case to benefit BN. The example is in Kedah after 1999 election when the commission was asked to again redelineate the constituency. But in 1999, what happened was that PAS won quite a number of seats in the state assembly. Now, in order to increase the number of seats in each state, you have to have a two-thirds majority in the state assembly. So because BN won only a simple majority in 1999, what they did was use gerrymandering to redraw the electoral district in order to favor BN, especially in this case UMNO, because in the case of Kedah, the contest even in the rural areas or semi-urban areas between PAS and UMNO has become very close. So what they did was really strengthen the UMNO stronghold. So basically, the BN uses a combination of malapportionment and gerrymandering to entrench, one can argue, UMNO Malay electoral dominance, and second, to retain two-thirds majority. The two-thirds majority comes in a case of, I'll show later on, in terms of after 1999, what they did was they further increased the number of mixed seats. Now, mixed seats was traditionally a problem before 2008 for any opposition ethnic-based party because they cannot win, for example, the DAP, enough Malay votes to win a mixed constituency. So they play around with that. So the argument is electoral dominance maintained through disproportionate numbers of Malay majority seats relative to its population. Second argument is that the UMNO Malay electoral dominance is used to they use it by through gerrymandering to neutralize PAS. For example, the Kedah case, when they increase the number of mixed seats. Mixed seats here can mean basically 70%, no Malay majority, 70% they say, for example. If you're below 70%, PAS, when they contest against UMNO, in the past before 2008, it's almost impossible for them to win because they cannot win enough of the non-Malay votes. So this is a so here I'll show that basically the UMNO seats are usually much smaller than even the PAS seat. So so the malapportionment and gerrymandering is also used to further entrench UMNO dominance. And the last one is increasing the mixed seats to optimize ethnic voting behavior, meaning that opposition couldn't overcome the ethnic voting behavior. This is just some photos I took. This is a Lemak Pantai in the contest between Nurul and Nong Chik. As you can see, the battle of the flags, as I say, the BN won the battle of the flag, but they lost the battle in this case. This is defacing Nurul's poster. I think it happens on both sides. Okay? Not. I happen to be there, so I saw this one. I mean, people also defaced the Nong Chik's. This one, as Ki Beng, Meredith have mentioned about selling all this paraphernalia, And this is if you go by the electoral regulation, they're not supposed to ferry voters, but you see this probably all over the place being, they violate the rules. Usually Baristan, less Pakatan from what I can I hear. And this is, I just put it there because I've, it's a graffiti. If you stand in the past Central Market MRT, you see this graffiti there. Malaya heroes, who would imagine putting them together, right? Nick Aziz on the left and Mahathir on the right. And this is Malaya, not even Malaysian hero. Or maybe it's Malaya. Okay. So malapportionment can easily explain why you have Pakatan winning the popular votes, but losing the election, right? So over the years, I think this has been reiterated by many about the control and politicization of election commission over the years. especially the crucial year is 1962, when they basically first sort of neutralize the authority of the Electoral Commission, and second, politicize it by increasingly appointing people who are not basically neutral. And in terms of the delineation of constituencies over the years, you can see how it has changed. When it first set up in 1955, you can have a seat which is only 33% smaller or bigger than the average size. 1957, the Reid Commission tried to lower the disparity by having a 15% plus minus margin. But this was never adopted because after the 1959 election, the Tunku Abdul Rahman administration wanted to change the constituency. So that's what led to the 1962 revamp of the Electoral Commission. And at the same time, they also upped the limit to 50%. So a seat can be 50% smaller than the average, not the largest, the average. And after 69, the major electoral setback, they said, do away with the limits. So after 69, there are no limits. So as you can see, table 1. Now, the proportion between largest and smallest, you can see that 1969, before the removal of before the 50%, you have 4.43, right? But after 1974, you have 5.61. I mean, the largest is 5 to 6 times bigger than the smallest. Now, 2004 is not a characteristic, as I mentioned. There was a creation of a Putrajaya, so 20.5 is actually an anomaly as well. So you can be cheeky and say that it's so bad that in 2004 is 20.5, but you have to take into consideration that it was a new seat created in 2004, so it's not representative. But more in 2013, when Putrajaya has grown bigger to nearly 16,000, then you see that it's 9.9 times bigger, a larger seat to smallest. Again, that is probably the figures approaching to 8 to 9 times. Now, if you bring in Sabah and Sarawak, actually the average of the seats has also increased. As you can see that from 1969 to 74, it decreased because you increase the number of seats. Okay, so that's why the average size. But from 2004 to 2013, the number of seats have remained the same, right? But average size has grown because of population growth, and also because for 2013, it was amazingly high rate of new voter registration by those people who have reached the age of voting and those who have not voted for years, including me, myself. And the disparity becomes even bigger if you bring in Sabah and Sarawak, because the average voters there are much smaller. I mean, the size of each constituency. I mean, Sabah is only about 39,000 and Sarawak 35,000. Okay. Now, this is the table to show you the Malay majority, the fact that so far all the figures are for just Peninsula, not Malaysia. Now, the number of Malay majority seats have, as you can see, has increased with each exercise, right? Delineation exercise, right? For 64, 60 out of 204, that means the percent of majority Malay seats 56.7, even though their population is 54.4. 208, for example, the number of Malay majority here means above 50%. 113, total number is 165, and percent of Malay majority seats is 68.5, and percent of Malay electorate 58.9. Now, if you just use percent of Malay majorities divided by Malay electorate size, you get how overrepresented the Malay majority seats are, right? So for 64 is like 1.04, by 208 is 1.14 times. Now, consisting of ethnic type, here to show you that majority of the smaller constituency, 50,000 below, and then 50,000 and 65,000 and below are mostly Malay majority seats. So this is to further show the malapportionment of seats in favor of the Malay seats. And you can see that the majority of the Chinese seats are basically 65,000 and above. So that, all these are expected. Now the more interesting part is UMNO, right? If you look at this table, now UMNO seats are usually very small, 65,000 and above or 50,000 and below. For this election, they won out of the 44 seats, which have 50,000 and below, they won 37. And actually MIC, MCA, all these are just seats that the charity of UMNO give to its much weakened opponents. All those are basically Malay majority seats. Now DAP won one seat, which is very strange, which is in Beras Perak. We used to be a BN seat, but in 2008, for the first time, the DAP won. And it's a Chinese sort of slight Chinese majority seat. So you can see that in contrast, PAS, most of their seats are 65,000 and above, those that they won. So this to show that, what they have done is using malapportionment and gerrymandering. UMNO has actually carved out a smaller UMNO stronghold Malay seats to neutralize PAS in basically Kedah. For example, in Kelantan, the two seats which UMNO has won, I think for ages, Jeli and Gua Musang, have only about 20,000 odd voters. Whereas those won by PAS, you notice that they are much bigger, 80,000 or less. But of course, they also have smaller seats as well. But on average, this is what you are getting, the picture. UMNO stronghold are usually much smaller than PAS stronghold. I mean, things can change over the years, of course. Now, the second part is ethnic voting. Why mixed constituencies are important? Because this is the voting pattern before 2008. When you have a PAS UMNO contest, usually UMNO will win most of the votes, except for in Kelantan since 1990. And also the Malay votes will usually go for MCA, MIC, Gerakan over DAP. Similarly, the Chinese will vote mostly UMNO over PAS, and then DAP over MCA, MIC, Gerakan, right? The Indian, until the last election in 2008, majority have voted either UMNO over PAS or MCA, MIC, Gerakan over DAP, right? Now, what the opposition has tried to do, of course, is 1986, Tunku Razale formed realizing the problem with ethnic voting, formed two coalition, one with DAP called Gagasan, right? And then the other one with PAS called APU, trying to draw votes from. So that, the logic, of course, is that if you put PAS and DAP together, it's a no-go in 1986, right? But nevertheless, they lost because ethnic pattern, voting pattern remained the same, on the table. Same thing in 1999. Of course, this one, most of the seats that PAS won were actually huge Malay majority seats, not in any of the mixed constituency. Whereas DAP suffered a lot because in quite a number of the mixed constituency with less than 70% Chinese, actually they suffer a major thrashing in 1999. Again, in 1999, actually the campaign quite similar to 2013, where back then Mahathir was really playing up especially the religious divide over the Hudu, saying that UMNO is DAP is cahoots with selling out the Chinese, which the MCA or try again in 2010, but it works in 1999. So you can see that things have really changed since 1999. So now, so from here you can see that in 1999, UMNO won 92.7% of the mixed constituencies, right? So its rank is in the mixed constituency. In 2004, same thing, almost 98%, right? But then 2008, that's when you have the swing. You can see that the mixed constituency suddenly, shifted when you have the opposition finally overcoming the ethnic voting behavior that has been their bugbear since in the previous elections. That means, it's quite amazing if you talk to some even Malay workers, back in 2008, actually in 2004, even 2004, it was very hard for them psychologically to vote for DAP. For years it's been considered ethnic chauvinists, which is they're trying to play up against Chinese chauvinists and all this. Same time, very difficult for actually a non-Malay Muslim voter to vote PAS because of the hudud and all this. But 2008, everything changed, right? And that is the patterns in 2013. So what this means is that the BN no longer can depend on mixed constituency to retain its two-thirds majority, because unless of course something happened to the opposition, there's a split or whatever. But that is the trend. Mixed constituencies are no longer BN stronghold, right? Now the Malay of course the Chinese majority seats are, it's completely just a DAP basically. Now, Malay majority, you find that it's more, this time they did increase their seats, but only by 6, in terms of Malay majority. It's not that big in terms of the number they won. They won quite a number, of course, in the mix as well. But you find that the margin of victory varies. In the UMNO stronghold, they continue to win margins of like 20%, but except in places like Kelantan, Terengganu, where the margins are narrowing. And the problem for them is the trend is that the younger Malays are not majority are voting opposition. So that is a problem for them in the next election. How to continue, because the change of the voting behavior of the youth, especially the Malay, impact them in the Malay majority seats. Now the thing here is that the way they have you can say that the way they have sort of draw out malapportionment Germany is based on the racial calculation, racial issues and all this. But the thing is that the voting pattern of Malaysian voters have changed, right? They are now beginning to come to importance non-ethnic issues, corporate governance, clean governments, the crime issues in the urban areas, corruption problems within the Malay communities and all. So the rise of and also economic issues that Meredith raised. So this racial calculation was based on a faulty logic, which is that the UMNO will continue to be the champion of the Malays. Now that is very problematic for a big chunk of the Malay voters as well, especially in the urban areas. And of course, also the logic that the Chinese won't pass because the hudud and all this. But all this racial arithmetic doesn't work anymore. So they now have a problem in terms of in PRU 14, whether they have to do something, because the the voting behavior of Malaysians have changed. It's no longer so racialized. They have tried to put racialized and race and religion, but you can see the limits of the impact in this election. I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ho Kwan. That was perfect timing. Okay, having heard a variety of perspectives, we'll now proceed to questions. We actually have plenty of time for questions. That said, please do keep your questions brief and also let us know who you are. Yes, sir.
I enjoyed the presentations by all four speakers, but and I suppose they did stick to the title of the seminar, Reflections and Analyses. The last seminar that we had here in ICES was really looking forward to the GE13, and now we are looking at GE13. And I would like to ask the speakers whether they would like to look forward again after GE13. And while I have certain ideas of my own, I would like to ask them two questions. First, one, after Najib has won, what next? Is there somebody standing in the wings to succeed him, as he succeeded the previous Prime Minister, who also won the 2008 elections? And at first blush, I would think of three candidates who would be waiting in the wings. Two of them sons of former prime ministers, and one the son-in-law of a former prime minister. My second question is, after the May 69 elections, there was an expansion of the old coalition of races, and there was a bigger coalition across to the opposition when PAS, for example, came into the government. Now that the two-thirds majority is lost, what are the possibilities of a coalition of the coalitions? And you may not need to have every coalition partner inside, but maybe some of the coalition partners. After all, in '69, not everybody in the opposition came over. And the coalition of coalitions seems to have a certain precedent in the Westminster model, because Mr. Cameron and what is his Lib Dem? Huh? Clegg, yes. They contest against each other. So it is possible. Is it possible that the two coalitions in Malaysia could form a government at the center and continue to contest each other in the federal and the parliamentary elections?
Thank you for those very insightful questions. Do I have any takers?
Should we collect a few questions first?
I think these are pretty, I think we can deal with these first. Should we answer? Yes, I think so.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Yeah, two questions. Najib, the question now, of course, is Najib in jeopardy or not? I think not. I think Najib is still the BN's greatest asset at the moment. And although he did not win back the two-thirds, I think UMNO actually did increase their seats. And they have now the support of East Malaysia. And I think it's more about, that'll come to your second question about the MCA and Gerakan, of course. But I think Najib, I mean, I can't swear on this, but I think he actually looks more stable than before the elections, strangely enough. He did not win back Selangor, of course, but if one wants to look at that record, of course, over the last 5 years, he got back Perak and he got back Kedah. So, well, you know, you can't get the big pot, you get the small pot. But I think you did mention the three possible candidates. Of course, I think Khairi, well, he won't make PM by 40, as he had wanted. He'll still be a possible future leader, yes, definitely. Of course, at the moment, one looks at Muhyiddin, really. But Muhyiddin is 6-7 years older. I doubt he has a chance, unless Najib really fouls up at this point. I hope that answers the question. I think Najib is still their biggest asset at the moment. The alliance, this movement of alliance to BN, now what thing? I think, and then your comparison with what happened in England. I think in Malaysia, the concept of coalition is not the same, despite the Westminster system. Coalitions in Malaysia are like gangs, you know. Once you go in, you're in. You cannot just leave, unless you're a very small party and nobody cares if you leave. That's why we see the MCA Gerakan, they rather felt, after the 2008 election, they rather felt short of options, because they can't think of an option where they go against the Barisan itself or go against UMNO for that matter. And so what they ended up with was that they just continued being silent over the last 5 years. Of course, having said that, there are possibilities in the future, but I think that would depend on something dramatic happening, like PAS pulling out of Pakatan. Perhaps that would then suddenly mean that all bets are off or something. And if we judge from Najib's victory speech, where he talked about the Chinese tsunami, he also talked about national unity. Some people actually interpreted that as Malay unity that he was pointing at, not national unity. Because in that frame of mind, nation is the Malay nation. So that there's a difference how you interpret that. But then in politics, you say something vague, and then the public takes it a certain way, and you're stuck with it. I think that's what happened with Bangsa Malaysia and Mahathir as well. You say something you didn't really mean, but the public wanted you to mean it, and then you're stuck, you know. So there is this talk of Malaysian unity, meaning working across the coalitional lines. At the moment, I think the coalitions still look rather stable in themselves. The big change, of course, is that now the MCA and the Gerakan are practically gone. I can't imagine them coming back in any special way. And so we talk about how the Chinese are not represented. But perhaps that is not all that important at a certain level. Perhaps further down, where you relate to Chinese associations and all that, perhaps then that becomes important. But at the cabinet level, so far, it doesn't seem to matter very much. People are more concerned with ministers doing their work instead of asking the people to migrate, things like that. That's one way to win an election, you know. You don't support me, you leave. Yeah, those are my comments.
I'll try to be brief. So I'll start with just kind of pardoning, if you'll pardon the ageism and sexism of this, one very disgruntled, high-profile, dropped UMNO candidate in Perlis told us that the real leadership in UMNO is not Najib regardless, but an old man and a fat woman. That would be Mahathir and Rosma. He was, even though he had previously been an MP for UMNO, was actually voting opposition this time. So I think Najib doesn't seem to be showing any signs of leaving, nor does his wife seem to want him to leave. The one candidate that I keep hearing from all sides as the possible one who might actually bring something new to the table would be Tengku Razali. He would be certainly a dark horse candidate, but that could be an interesting shift. But mostly, I think Najib will remain. The more interesting question for me is actually this parallel with post-1969 and the BN. I would actually disagree a bit with Ki Beng and suggest that BN really needs some new premise before the next election. Right now, it's a party of Malays and Bumiputra almost exclusively. 88 seats for UMNO, 14 seats for PBB, a handful of seats, fewer than there are for PBB if you consider both MIC and MCA and Gerakan together. So it is no longer a coalition of communal unity that could in any way pretend to be even quasi-consociational. The proposals for how this change could happen is by moving from a coalition of parties to a BN with direct membership. And in fact, you saw that in the campaigns in some ways. It was very difficult to find, for instance, MCA or MIC flags. Sometimes you would see UMNO ones, but it was almost exclusively BN flags, right, which also helped to highlight this supposed fragmentation of Pakatan. Or it could be through some realignment of parties, though I agree that rarely seems to happen much, or just by a committed nativist turn. Just forget this illusion of being a multiracial party and just say, forget it. This is now the big party for the majority. On the other hand, I think Pakistan is actually sufficiently cohesive. There's not that much more dividing those parties than there isn't dividing the parties in the BN, and more relatively egalitarian in terms of the relative strength, that it makes more sense for the members of Pakistan, assuming that they actually go by sense instead of other considerations, to remain fixed as is. While I keep hearing this discussion of the Malay unity talks between UMNO and PAS, just in logical terms, which again may not rule the day, but I would see no incentive for PAS to be such a second fiddle to UMNO within BN when it can be a dominant, an equal partner at least, if not a dominant partner within Pakistan. So that would be my take on these.
Thank you, Francis. To answer your question, I agree with the other two speakers that Najib will survive, but not the reasons they gave. The reason why Najib will survive is people keep forgetting that internal UMNO politics is much more important, and it's all about patronage. So one of the things that you see is that the way he appointed the cabinet from the West Malaysian side was very strategic. He's appointing basically warlords, people who can bring the UMNO delegates to him. So the trick is to see what happens in the coming UMNO general elections. In terms of the three candidates that you mentioned who are potential successors, I would actually write off the first two, the children. They've got no chance in PRE voting. And also the third one, the son-in-law, actually has no chance in the next one as well. In fact, if Najib is going to fall, which I don't think he will fall, right, it will not be any of the three people that you mentioned. Secondly, to answer your question about the BN being coming up with a new coalition, I don't think that is possible as well. It's not possible for a simple reason that PAS at the present moment is not in a position to be split and say one side goes with UMNO. PAS will be in a position to discuss the so-called Malay unity government seriously only if one condition is met, and which is that Aziz is no longer head of the Sugar Council. As long as he's there, that negotiations there will be a lot of chattering, but nothing serious will come about it. The other thing is that a lot of people forget that Barisan is actually a registered political party in its own right. And in fact, there are people who are direct members of Barisan already. In fact, their first direct candidate was in 2008. So in fact, it is possible for Malaysians in this room to actually join Barisan directly. You don't actually have to go to one of these component parties. And in fact, the most recent minister that they appointed was a direct BN candidate minister, which is Idris Jala. So in fact, people keep forgetting the basics, and that's the reason why they are allowed to use their own symbol, the Barisan symbol. So in fact, it is already registered. But my take is slightly different from my two colleagues there. I don't think that the ethnic political parties will disappear. People keep forgetting that it's not possible for people like MCA to merge, all that sort of thing. The reason is because parties like MCA, UMNO, and Gerakan Rakyat, they hold virtually billions of ringgits in assets. It's not a secret, I can tell you that MCA alone is worth at a minimum 1.6 billion ringgit. I don't want to tell you how much UMNO is worth, you have to pay me for that. But this is just an example of why it is not possible for the parties to merge. In Malaysia, when big money is involved, right, people become very selfish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we can have a couple more questions. You, sir.
I'm T.H. Chin from Tien San. Just want to ask one question first. Can you explain the Perak popular votes? Because the popular votes is so high, and yet the loss.
Another couple of questions. You, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Albert Chai, a political observer. I find the UMNO Barisan government is rather unique in the sense that normally for a good government in the world, they will promote harmony among the races. But in this case, it seems that if there's harmony among the races in Malaysia, it runs counter to the party interest. That's why UMNO seems to be playing a racial politics. rather than racial harmony or conciliation among the races. It seems that when there's a good relationship between various races in Malaysia, it runs counter to the interests of the ruling party. This is very unique in the world, because normally a good government in power will like the country to be in harmony. So this is very strange. So in this respect, how long can they go if they continue that way? Can you give a deep thought on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have one more question before we proceed to hear. Over there, sir.
Two short questions. One is for the panel. Were there any proof of fraudulent votes? I mean, besides money politics, which is quite common in some Southeast Asian countries. That's the first question. The second question is to my friend Kee Beng. If there are no fraudulent votes, or there are fraudulent votes, do you think Pakatan will continue with their protests? In the sense that, will this protest fizzle out eventually? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps Kee Beng, if you'd like to go first. Sure.
Right. I'll see if I should answer all the questions. The popular vote, I think Hock Guan might be better at answering that. BN, how long it will last, and the paradox of having a party that actually does not unite the people. I think the ingenious solution to that had been going on was actually the alliance BN system, where UMNO was not the only party that was rabidly racist, but the MCA and everybody else as well. So the BN model, the alliance model, allowed for this, so that you be racist for your party, I'll be for your group, I'll be racist for my group, and let's sit down at some meeting, and the public will think that we actually agreed and compromised. And I think that was how Malaysia could so quickly gain independence, despite being so disparate on many fronts. And that is why I think that's where the question came from earlier about what happens now when the MCA or the Chinese are not really represented. I think in a way the society has to some extent moved away from it. They're looking at other things instead of just race. Governance issues, I think, is clouding the overshadowing racial issues to some extent. Fraudulent votes. Well, you got a lot through SMS and Facebook and all that, but of course they all have to remain as rumors. But I think Hock Guan might be able to say more because he was at Lembah Pantai. Because, well, there was supposed to be a barricade trying to stop cars from coming in carrying extra boxes of votes, marked 120, which is the neighboring constituency. How true that is, I don't know, maybe Hock Guan would know better. But in Johor, you had SMSs late in the day. Most people voted actually early, before noon. And the news going around then was that the Malays were not voting. The Chinese had voted. The Malay voter rate was very low. But at the end, it didn't turn out that way. So I don't know what's rumor and what's not. But in Johor, SMSs were going around saying, that polling station is under attack. Attack meaning that there's a bus of Bangladeshis coming. And then you will get the Johorians actually rushing there to protect the integrity of their polling station. And then when they're there, they'll get another message. And some of this might be just people playing around, right? But definite proof, I don't think we are in that position to really give. Then finally, about the protest, I suppose Anwar coming that close, just couldn't let it be. But after the fact, I think, rightly or wrongly, I think there was intuitively that strategy that the Pakatan actually managed to mobilize the urban population to a tremendous extent. And then 5th of May comes, and the big anticlimax. And somehow you can't let it end there. You have to have some after party, as it were, after the fact. And I think that's what that's the function these rallies are fulfilling. So I don't think they will continue. I think it will peter out, and then their main function will be done, which is to get those who got engaged in the Pakatan project that it's not over yet. We have another 5 years to. It's taking longer than we thought, but we'll keep going. I think that would be the long-term effect of it. Thanks.
Again, very briefly, in terms of the BN and its model, the alliance or BN model assumes that a communal identity is a dominant identity or the only identity that matters for voters, and that what Leipart calls segmental autonomy would be sufficient for dealing with the really divisive issues, those that are unique to one or another group and can't be settled by consensus. I think what we've seen is that those are not the only identities that matter now for voters, and so to some extent, that BN model of race baiting, for instance, to stir people toward voting only for this stable party is triggering only popular resentment against that clear manipulation of what are presumed to be dominant identities. So I think that suggests that the BN model as it has been, as I said, I think has to change and will change, is changing, but that doesn't mean that communal identities are gone. It just means that that's not the only reason that people vote. In terms of the fraudulent votes, I would recommend Jagkumar Devaraj, the PSM candidate, and Sungai Suputi, a piece in the Aliran Monthly, in which he very carefully goes through all the different allegations of fraud in his own district and debunks most of them as basically misinformation. A lot of the grievance that we're hearing now is not so much the frenzied reports of Bangladeshi and Indonesian busloads and so forth, but rather about the structural malapportionment that Hokwan detailed. And so that's a very different issue from actual fraud. That's a skew, but it's not the same thing as sending in phantom voters and so forth.
Thanks, Hokwan. If you'd like to comment on Perak.
Just on Perak. Perak was under BN control until 2008. Of course, what happened subsequently. There was this frogs tree. But so over the every 10 years during the exercise, they have continuously increased the malapportionment and gerrymandering to advantage the BN. So when you say about the popular votes, you're referring to the state government, right? Not the parliament. So it's not surprising that they can win a much bigger compared to the for the parliament seats at the Peninsular level. That higher margin in terms of the popular votes and still lose, right? Yeah, I mean this is because of if you look at just the size of the seats, you can. I mean, it's actually quite useful now with all this all this data that they give online. Just click Excel and you find all this. All the smaller seats are usually UMNO, and then the bigger seats are, in this case, usually the DAP seats. So that shows you the the problem with malapportionment. In the Perak case, it's more skewed because of the ethnic composition of the voters compared to others.
Are there some more questions? Someone calling for my attention before over on this part.
I think we did not answer a question about looking forward, what to expect now, other than who's going to take over, right? I suppose the question was wider than that. If I may say a few words on that, I think we have to look at why I mentioned earlier, the post-Mahathir period under Abdullah and under Najib, and there is a difference, especially in the late Abdullah period. We got the kind of race baiting that we saw the last week coming from the Home Affairs Minister. That's why I mentioned it a few times, because I see it as a throwback to the pre-Basay period. They're trying this race baiting as politics, and I hope it won't work this time. And I don't think it will, because I think Malaysia does move on. The consciousness of people does change. So going forward, it's still an open question which side we will go. Will we continue the transformation that Najib has, whether sincerely or not, doesn't matter. But he will have to come up with transformation programs. Or will we have the Abdullah period where it's all talk and nothing institutional gets done?
Can I just add on the malapportionment? According to the regulation, there are two types of changes to the seats. Right? One is increasing the number of seats, and for each state, in order to, you have to get approval, a two-thirds majority of the state assembly. So you can see that now that's not possible for BN to do in quite a number of states because they don't have two-thirds majority, right? So they can only do it in states where they command a two-thirds majority. Second is gerrymandering, redrawing the seats. Now you need only a simple majority. So that is something they can pursue in states where they have just a simple majority without a two-thirds majority. But you can see that it's getting harder because when the contests are smaller, when they don't have the two-thirds majority, it's sort of, and also it sort of limit their using the gerrymandering or malapportionment.
Do we have any more questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Swani and I'm with the Malaysia Forum, Singapore. As a young person, I've observed that this last general election, Najib used an extremely personality-driven, almost presidential style of campaigning. And my question to the whole panel is, to what extent do you think the strategy will be sustainable all the way to the next election? Because, I mean, self-promotion among the young, using Facebook personalities and such and so forth, has sort of shown itself this election. But is the strategy a long-term one, or will it fizzle out?
Any other questions? Sir.
Can I address this question to James Ching? The PBB party basically is not fully Malay party. It's basically a mixture of the diet of the Christians and the Malay. Now the PBB playing active role with the UMNO in the federal. How do you look at the consequences? Then currently the SPDP, they have said to Najib, say, thank you for the minister post, you can take it back. So how is it going to play out the game?
Any other questions? Perhaps James, if you'd like to take the last question.
Okay, if I understand your questions, if I understand your questions correctly, is that what sort of party is PBB? Is it Malay-based? The answer is no. PBB is basically a Muslim-based party, but the core leadership has remained the same since its founding in the 1960s. It's led by a very small minority group in Sarawak. These are the Malanaos. They come basically from the coastal area just outside of Cebu. In Sarawak, they will project themselves as Melanau, but in Peninsular politics, they'll project themselves as Malay. So they have a dual identity. PBB itself is actually divided into two large factions. One is the Bumiputera faction, which is the Melanau-led faction. The other side is the Pesaka faction, which is the Iban-based faction. The Iban faction is basically Anglican Christians in origin. But it doesn't matter when they project themselves in Barisan National Politics, they project themselves as a Muslim-based party. So in that sense, it really doesn't matter when it comes to carving at the federal level. But like, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, their role is crucial because East Malaysia plus UMNO is 91% of Barisan Nasional. So they are what we call in Sarawak now, they are the BMOC, big men on campus now. Now, in terms of SPDP, is the split very serious? Yes, the split was very serious, but in a way, the split doesn't really matter because what happened in Sarawak is that in the 1980s, there was a complete restructuring of diet politics in Sarawak. And that restructuring is not completed yet. You have to understand that in 1971, there was a very strategic alliance built between two groups, and these are the bedrock of Sarawak politics. This is Melanau politician with the Cebu Fujiao Chinese, the money men. They interlock each other and they created a very, very strong foundation that has ruled Sarawak since then. This is outside the party system, we're talking about individuals. And this system has basically ruled Sarawak until today. It is still there. The parties may change, but the personality behind the parties are still basically the same. Okay, the only people who can break this iron lock is basically the diet community, and that's the reason why the diet community has constantly been divided through different parties. So, for example, since 1970, you've never had a single diet party. You have never had a single diet party or a single Iban party. And the strongest attempt to create a single diet or Iban-based party to challenge the hegemony was actually in 1987 when PBDS was formed. And as those of you who know Sarawak history, right, within 10 years, this unity faction was broken up deliberately into different parties. So the joke I always tell my friends that the mother of all political parties in Sarawak is PBDS, because PDS created SWP, SPDP, all these party PRS all came from PBDS because it was broken up. So after they restructure Dayak or Iban politics in Sarawak, right, the next group to be restructured is of course the Chinese, and that's exactly what you're seeing now. The Chinese community in Sarawak will be restructured in such a way that they are not allowed to challenge this hegemony, the one that I talked about that was set up in 1971.
In terms of the presidential issue, you actually saw this on both sides, but it was more clear for the BN side. So you saw the Bersama Anwar Putrajaya posters everywhere, but also Najib's face. The creepiest version was these "In Najib We Trust" stickers that we saw in Sabah and Sarawak. And they sort of biblical tone to some of the, we bring electrifications, we bring light to darkness, whatever. So I would say that in terms of the BN side, it depends on two things. One is whether Najib is still in office and whether there's a likely successor, but then also this time his popularity was higher than that for the BN as a whole. And so running under Najib was in some ways a safer bet than running under the BN. So that coattail effect, though, doesn't tend to work as well in a parliamentary system as a presidential system, so it's not clear that that would necessarily persist. The same would be true for Pakistan. If Anwar eventually does do what he had said he would do and step down since his coalition didn't win, there's no clear successor to be the charismatic leader who would unite the coalition in the way that Anwar can claim to do. It would probably have to be someone from Keadilan rather than DRP or PAS. It has to be a Malay. There are all these criteria that have to be met, and it's not so certain who that person would be. But we could have, 5 years minus 2 weeks from this point. So a lot could happen, but so we could still see a return to the presidential style. It fits with the structure of a very expensive top-down coalitional campaign, right, that to have that one leader, especially when you have elections called at the last moment. So you want to prepare some of your posters and all that in advance. You don't know who will be standing. And so you do know who the leader of the coalition will be. So that was one of the arguments, one of the just logistical ones for why you saw so many posters with the face of Anwar or Najib instead of the actual candidate. But I think it just depends on who's actually leading these coalitions at that point.
Yeah, okay. My response to your question, quite good. Oh, I rather like your question. Najib, the BN campaign seemed rather presidential because by default, there's nothing else. Thai Mahmud wasn't going to appear because it's just a B minus. Did you Chua Soi Lek, Ko Su Kun, Peter Chin, all the coalition leaders were gone. There was only Najib. So by default, it had to be rather presidential. And of course, the logistics, I think, would play a bit in there. But about Najib being slightly more popular or a lot more popular than BN itself, I suspect, I might be wrong, that in Malaysian politics, among the non-Malays, you tend to relate to UMNO in a good cop, bad cop fashion. And Najib did, I think, consciously from the very start choose to be good cop. And so he's more popular. BN becomes bad cop. Muhyiddin keeps quiet and is a bad cop because he's letting Pakasa speak. That kind of game is, I think, played in Malaysia. And on the other side, the Pakatan couldn't possibly be as presidential because it's a wider movement with the colors and all that. And what was impressive was how the young people spoke in Pakatan. I thought, where did they train? They were really good in reacting with the crowd. So they were like a hydra, like I said before. There loads of different leaders, and I think so the difference became very great between how BN was doing it and how Pakatan was doing it.
Do we have any last questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Max Chu. Given the current cabinet formation, right, it was thought that it's an interim cabinet waiting for the component parties to general election for the component parties to form, right, to decide who are the final cabinet members. What are your opinion that the MCA, Gerakan, and whoever, will reappoint
be reappointed into the cabinet. That's one. The other one is that are the Chinese over idealistic, right, in expecting the change from Pakatan? Because given Malaysian politics, the race issue is always there. And corruption will, in my opinion, right, will not go away, whoever comes in. Thank you.
Okay, on the interim cabinet, yes, I believe strongly that MC and Gerakan will eventually get back into cabinet before PRU 14.
Meredith or Keeping?
Okay. The MCA Gerakan in government, yeah, I do agree with James Chin, but I suspect if you're the head of the MCA and you don't have office, and if you allow your people to become ministers and all that, their patronage power can very quickly become bigger than yours. And I suppose that's why Najib keeps a couple of seats waiting for after the MCA election, because you don't know what's going to happen then. Maybe Choi Soy-Lek will be out, and maybe some other leader will allow, can become a minister. I don't know. It's still a big question mark there. Race, of course, is not going away, but I think what is happening in Malaysia today, and, well, let's just say are the Chinese being optimistic, I think, I would prefer to say the urban crowd. I think it's part of urban living, urban education and all that you think race doesn't reflect your whole daily life. Now and then, perhaps in the evening and you've had a drink, but otherwise the race aspect does not come in very much. And I think where we're at in Malaysia is that the limits of race-based politics, BN style, are being reached. Where do we go from here, really? If we keep to this race-based politics as expressed through BN, which is rotting from within because MCA is falling and all that, where does Malaysia go from here? I think that is the big question.
One last question. If not, okay, please join me in thanking the presenters for very enlightening presentations.